A few years ago, I noticed something strange about myself. I was standing in a grocery store, staring at two almost identical products. One was labeled bestseller. The other wasn't. Without thinking, I grabbed the one everyone else seemed to prefer. As I walked away, a question hit me. Had I actually made a choice, or had the choice been made for me? I used to believe I was a rational person. Most of us do. We think our opinions are our own. Our decisions are carefully considered. Our reactions make sense because they're based on logic. At least, that's what I thought. Back then, my life looked pretty normal. I worked a regular office job, followed a routine, spent weekends with friends, and scrolled through social media more than I probably should have. Nothing seemed unusual. But once I started paying attention, I began noticing patterns. Small ones. The kind that are easy to ignore. For example, every Monday morning, my coworker David would walk into meetings with complete confidence. He wasn't always the smartest person in the room. Sometimes his ideas weren't even the strongest. Yet people listened. Meanwhile, another coworker would suggest nearly identical ideas and receive little attention. At first, I assumed it was charisma. But over time, I realized something deeper was happening. Psychologists call it the halo effect. When we perceive one positive trait in someone, confidence, attractiveness, success, we automatically assume they possess other positive qualities too. Without realizing it, we give them extra credibility. And suddenly I couldn't stop seeing it. People trusted well-dressed strangers more quickly. Popular creators seemed smarter simply because they had larger audiences. Successful people were often assumed to be wiser in areas completely unrelated to their success. The realization was uncomfortable. How many of my judgments weren't really judgments at all? A few weeks later, another situation caught my attention. My friend Ethan was trying to choose a new apartment. He showed me two options. The first seemed reasonable. The second was clearly overpriced and poorly located. Yet after viewing the second apartment, the first suddenly felt like an amazing deal. That made no sense. Nothing about the first apartment had changed. Then I learned about the anchoring effect. The first piece of information we encounter often becomes the reference point for everything that follows. Prices. Opinions. Expectations. Even when the anchor is irrelevant. It explained why expensive restaurant menus often include one outrageously priced item. It makes everything else feel affordable. Again, I found myself wondering how many decisions I believed were logical. And how many were simply comparisons. Around that time, I started paying closer attention to social media. One evening, I noticed a heated argument in the comments section of a video. Hundreds of people were debating. Everyone seemed absolutely convinced they were right. I clicked through profiles. Different ages. Different backgrounds. Different experiences. Yet every person appeared certain. That's when I encountered confirmation bias. The tendency to seek information that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring information that challenges them. Once I understood it, something uncomfortable happened. I stopped seeing it only in other people. I started seeing it in myself. I realized I was reading articles that agreed with me. Following voices that reinforced my views. Paying attention to evidence I liked. And quietly dismissing evidence I didn't. That realization was harder to accept than I expected. Because nobody likes discovering they aren't as objective as they thought. Then something happened that changed the way I looked at human behavior entirely. My company hired a new manager. His first week was rough. People complained about his decisions. His communication style felt awkward. Many employees immediately disliked him. Including me. I remember thinking, this isn't going to work. But over the next several months, something interesting happened. The manager improved. He listened, adapted, learned from mistakes. By the end of the year, many employees respected him, including me. One afternoon, I looked back at my first impressions and realized how unfair they had been. That led me to the fundamental attribution error. When other people make mistakes, we often blame their character. When we make mistakes, we blame circumstances. If someone cuts us off in traffic, we think they're rude. If we cut someone off, we're just running late. It sounds simple. But recognizing this pattern changed how I viewed people. Suddenly, strangers seemed more human. Maybe the cashier wasn't unfriendly. Maybe she was exhausted. Maybe the coworker wasn't careless. Maybe he was overwhelmed. For the first time, empathy felt less like a virtue and more like a skill. A few months later, I experienced another lesson. I decided to start exercising regularly. The first week was easy. The second week wasn't. By the third week, motivation disappeared. Yet something surprising happened. The more consistently I showed up, the easier it became. Not because I suddenly loved exercise. Because my brain had adapted. This is partly explained by the consistency principle. Once people commit to something, they tend to behave in ways that remain consistent with that commitment. We like seeing ourselves as predictable, reliable, stable. And our behavior often follows that story. That's why small commitments can become powerful. The first step matters more than most people realize. Then came a theory that made me rethink advertising completely. One day I noticed a song playing in a coffee shop. It wasn't special. In fact, I didn't even like it much. But after hearing it several times over the following weeks, I started enjoying it. Nothing about the song changed. Only my exposure to it. This is called the mere exposure effect. The more familiar something becomes, the more comfortable we often feel with it. Brands know this. Politicians know this. Content creators know this. Repeated exposure creates trust even when no meaningful information is added. That realization made me question how many preferences were truly mine, and how many were simply familiar. Then there was the theory that explained one of the strangest experiences of my life. I once attended a large networking event. Before entering, I felt nervous. Everyone seemed successful, confident, important. As I walked through the room, I became convinced people were noticing every awkward thing I did. Every pause. Every mistake. Every uncomfortable interaction. Hours later, I spoke with several attendees. Most admitted they had felt exactly the same way. That's when I learned about the spotlight effect. We dramatically overestimate how much other people notice us. In reality, most people are focused on themselves. Just like we are. That single insight reduced years of unnecessary anxiety. But perhaps the most powerful realization came from observing a friend named Sarah. Sarah always compared herself to others. Career progress, income, relationships, achievements. No matter what she accomplished, someone else seemed ahead. One day she told me, "I feel like I'm losing a race I never agreed to run." That sentence stayed with me. Psychology calls this social comparison theory. We naturally evaluate ourselves by comparing ourselves to others. The problem is that comparisons rarely tell the full story. We compare our behind-the-scenes reality to someone else's highlight reel, and then wonder why we feel inadequate. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much unhappiness comes from invisible comparisons. Then I encountered another theory that explained countless disagreements. Two people can witness the exact same event and leave with completely different interpretations. Not because one is lying. Because perception itself is selective. This relates to selective perception. We notice what aligns with our expectations, fears, priorities, and beliefs. The world isn't only what happens around us. It's also how our minds filter what happens. That idea fascinated me, because it suggested that changing our perspective might literally change our experience. And then I discovered something even more surprising. The reciprocity principle. When someone gives us something, a favor, kindness, compliment, or gift, we often feel an internal pressure to give something back. Most people don't notice this influence. Yet it shapes friendships, business relationships, marketing, and everyday interactions. It quietly guides behavior beneath the surface. The same is true for loss aversion. Psychologists have found that losses often feel more painful than equivalent gains feel rewarding. Losing $20 hurts more than finding $20 feels good. That explains why people hold on to bad investments. Stay in unhappy situations. Avoid necessary risks. We're often protecting ourselves from loss more than pursuing growth. And finally, I encountered a theory that tied everything together. The self-fulfilling prophecy. When we expect something to happen, our behavior often helps create that outcome. If we expect rejection, we may become distant. If we expect failure, we may stop trying. If we expect success, we may persist longer. Our beliefs influence our actions. And our actions influence our results, which then reinforce our beliefs. A quiet cycle. One that's easy to miss. Looking back, none of these theories changed human nature. They simply revealed it. The biggest surprise wasn't learning that people are influenced by psychology. The biggest surprise was realizing how often I was influenced by psychology without noticing. I thought I was making independent decisions. But many of my choices were shaped by familiarity, comparison, assumptions, expectations, social pressure, and perception. And honestly, that realization felt unsettling at first. But eventually it became freeing. Because once you recognize these invisible forces, you start seeing them in real time. You pause before judging someone. You question your assumptions. You become curious about your own reactions. And that curiosity changes everything. Today, when I notice myself forming an instant opinion, making a quick decision, or reacting emotionally, I try to ask a simple question. What's influencing me right now that I can't see? Most of the time, there's an answer. And often, that answer reveals more about human behavior than the situation itself. Because the greatest hidden truth about psychology isn't that our minds influence our lives. It's that they often do it silently. Every day. Every conversation. Every decision. Every assumption. And maybe the most important life lesson is this. If so much of our behavior happens beneath awareness, how many parts of ourselves are we still discovering?